Good morning, everybody. Good to see you. It's Happy New Year for those I haven't seen. I think I've seen most of it except for you, but congratulations. Welcome on board. Happy to have you here. All those who are out there, I see Secretary Hicks, President Gonzalez, President Johnson, welcome. We'll quickly just go around. I think everybody knows each other, but just for the sake of introduction, we'll go around. We'll start with you, Bob Jackson. How about that?
Bob Jackson, Murray State University. Good to see everyone.
James Tipton, State Representative, House District 53.
Jay Morgan, Morehead State University.
Eli Capilouto, University of Kentucky.
Tim Cavoni, Western Kentucky University.
Aaron Thompson, CBE.
Bill Payne, council staff.
Sean McKiernan, council staff. David McFadden, Eastern Kentucky University.
Anita Brown, Northern Kentucky University.
Paul Verfano, Kentucky Community Technical College System.
And I think we have everybody here except for Senator Gibbons. Excuse me? Oh, yeah, virtual people, introduce yourselves. Sorry.
Lori Gonzalez, Interim President, University of Louisville.
John Hicks, State Budget Director, Secretary of the Governor's Cabinet.
President Johnson, are you on the line? Well, we see his picture, so we'll welcome him. So as you all know, in the last bill, we were called to come together now to really look at substantively, should there be any changes to their performance funding law. This work group is duly commissioned, if you will, to take a look at those, make recommendations to the House, Senate, Governor's office about what those changes are. And that's what we're here. And I'll let Bill, I won't take a lot of time with this part of it, other than just to say that my hope is that by the time it's over, we have something that we all agree on to make recommendations for and to, and that we are in a position whereby that we can then look at the next several years as operating from that particular funding process. So with that in mind, Bill Payne, I'll let you kind of take it from here. We hope for a lot of interaction throughout these meetings, by the way. But not that I have to worry about too many of you doing that, but just to know that even though there's some presentation here, expectations are that it's going to be a very interactive sort of session.
Thank you, President Thompson. Good morning, campus president, elected leaders, Secretary Hicks. We've got a pretty full agenda this morning. This is an overview of the topics. This is a repeat of what you see in your agenda. After some introduction and some housekeeping activities, we're going to provide you with a little bit of background information. Sean's going to talk about some of the major components that are used in the funding model and the metrics and how those were selected. We may or may not go through in any detail the model mechanics. It depends on how much time the president used in making the comments and having some discussion. We're going to provide some information about the performance fund distributions and the impact on our campuses, and then some student outcomes data. So without hesitation, we'll jump on into the introduction. What we want to do in this section is just talk about the working group's charge. What are your primary responsibilities? We want to look at the timeline for the completion of work. We want to have some discussion among the presidents and the other work group members about how frequently the work group should meet. We've got a draft timeline in your packets. Which CPE staff will support the work of this group and how can they be contacted? And then finally, we've got a list of resource materials that we think may be helpful for this group over the next 8 to 9 months. The performance funding statute, KRS 164092, reads as follows: beginning in fiscal year 2020-21 and every 3 fiscal years thereafter, the post-secondary education working group shall convene to determine if the comprehensive funding model is functioning as expected identify any unintended consequences of the model, and recommend any adjustments to the model. And we are to report the recommendations and the results of that review to the governor, the interim joint committee on A&R, and the interim joint committee on education by close of business of December 1st of this year. So that's what you're charged to do. In terms of the timeline, at the top of this slide, you can see that our first meeting obviously is today, January 25th. We have to report to the governor and General Assembly by December 1st. Tentatively, what we've scheduled as the final meeting of this work group is October 18th. That will give us time to take your recommendations and put them into a form that we can submit them to the governor and the General Assembly. And you have proposed meeting dates there on the bottom left-hand side of the slide. We're proposing that every meeting be on a Wednesday, approximately 6 weeks apart. But as you can see by the red bracket, half these dates correspond to previously scheduled president's meetings. And we are proposing a 1 p.m. start time for all future meetings. You've also got in your packet a copy of the timeline, Heather. I don't know if you can pull that up or not in the middle of this presentation.
I think they-
Okay, we've handed it out here and we've sent it out to everyone, but you can review that timeline. And I'm going to open it up to the presidents and other work group members at this time.
Bill, I do have a question. September 23rd is actually on a Saturday. And you may be mixing the third Wednesday is the 20th, so I just wanted to point that out.
Let's see. I've got September 6th in my timeline. It just must be incorrect on that slide.
Yeah, I just wanted
Yes,
to point
thank
that
you.
out.
Yeah, thank you, Representative Tipton. That should be the first Wednesday in September,
First Wednesday,
which
okay.
is September 6th. So the slide is incorrect.
It's right on the sheet.
And why would we have, is the October 18th, that's not a regular president's meeting, so that's just in 6 weeks apart. I guess.
Yeah, that's correct. And you had
Right.
indicated to me and Sean that you would like for us to try to finish up sometime in October.
That's right.
So there's a frequency of meetings, 6 meetings after today's meeting, look about right to this group, and is everyone okay with a meeting about once every 6 weeks?
Yes.
Okay, hearing no objections, we'll go ahead and have Heather send out meeting invitations following this meeting. And go ahead and get those scheduled. In terms of the CPE staff that will be supporting this work group, if you need data validation or have an information request regarding data, please contact Travis Muncie. He's the executive director of our Data and Advanced Analytics Unit. And he works directly with the campus institutional research directors. If you have questions involving model calculations or want any scenarios run, please contact me or Sean McKiernan. And we work directly with your campus CBOs. I will call attention to the footnote at the bottom. Any and all requests for metric data or funding scenarios and responses to such requests will be shared with all working group members. We didn't send out this large packet of information containing all of these resource material because we didn't want campus presidents or the other members of the working group to feel like they had to read all of this prior to today's meeting. But we will be sending all of this information out to each of you. We think this information will be helpful over the next 8 to 9 months as you perform your work. It includes the goal and guiding principles that were used in the funding model development back in 2016. There was a post-secondary education work group report that was submitted in December of 2016. That's the initial working group. Copy of the performance funding statute as amended to include the work of the 2020 work group. And you can see the next item there is the 2020 work group recommendations submitted to the governor and General Assembly in December of 2020. There's the performance fund distribution for the most recent year. This past September, we sent out performance funding surveys to the campuses. They've completed those surveys. We will give you copies of those. And then lastly, in addition to some of the student outcomes data that we're going to share with you today at the macro level, we've got very detailed data down to the institution level for the universities and KCT students. We will send that information out to you as well. Right here, President Thompson, is where you had asked for us to take a break in terms of going through the packet. And we had sent out an email to the presidents and asked them to come prepared to make some comments and to answer three basic questions. What has been the overall impact of performance funding on your campus over the past 6 years? What was the impact on your campus of changes made in statute following the 2020 working groups review? And just to remind everyone, the recommendations of the 2020 working group were to eliminate the stop-loss carve-outs of campus-based funds and also to establish the 2020-21 funding floor. And then lastly, do any of you have any pressing concerns about the funding models going forward? And so with that, President Thompson, we'll stop and allow you and the other presidents to comment.
Well, and I hope, I'm not sure how much we're recording this, but I was hoping Senator Gibbons had a chance to hear this too, since he was one of the major bill drafters on this. But what we wanted to hear, and we've heard a lot already from the president, we wanted this whole group to have an opportunity to voice whatever they need to voice. In the beginning here, we're asking us for a few minutes. So obviously, this is really food for thought, at least a quick executive summary of where we've been. Oh, I see Senator Gibbons on board now. Good to see you, sir. And so this is an opportunity for you all to lay out the argument, if you want to call it that. So I'll tell you what, we'll start around this end of the table with Paul.
Sure thing, thank you. Of course, I wasn't here the first time around with performance-based funding.
I'm looking around the table. Who was here the first time around? I want to guess, yeah. Eli, I guess that makes you and I, I won't call us old. We've just been around a minute.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
The grandfathers of performance-based funding. Perfect. So in response to the performance-based funding, we've implemented new and additional student success strategies, which have been very good.
By the way, can you hear everybody talking, those in virtual land? Okay.
And we believe it works best if it's fully funded with new dollars. There's been some unintended consequences of the model. We support a model that increases equity and stability, contains metrics that are representative of all of our college regardless of location, and provides every college an equal opportunity. The current model, we have 6 colleges that are really never in the winner's circle. Those are our coal colleges. This year, with the influx of performance-based funding money, 2 of them did get performance-based funds, but Hazard, Southeast, Henderson, and Big Sandy have never received performance-based funding. And that's because the metrics skew towards volume. They skew towards places where access to students is more plentiful. So our larger schools with larger enrollment tend to get more favorable results. We've got a few recommendations that we think would help this out. Using a 3-year weighted average to smooth out some of these ups and downs would greatly help us. Allowing those earned performance funds to become part of the base. It's difficult with non-recurring dollars to start up the program and keep the program going. Promoting equity within the model by accounting for regional differences, perhaps looking at a community needs index that could help our colleges that have been on the outside of this. Merging sector-specific credentials, STEM plus H, high wage, high demand, targeted industry within the overall 3-year weighted average credential calculation. Potentially incorporating an additional metric based on individual comparison to what that college did in the year prior. So improvement from one year to the next is something that's a component. It's not all of it, but it is a component of the performance-based funding model in Tennessee. And lastly, adding a metric for adult learners. But overall, we are fully supportive of this. It it drives us in the right direction, and we look forward to hopefully tweaking the model some.
Thank you, Paul. We're just gonna zigzag across the table if you don't mind, to offer equity to the conversation. Bob will.
Sure. Thank you. So I looked at positives and some negatives, and I want to say from the positive standpoint, we obviously Murray State supports the model. We've helped go through and shape the process. The change we made from recommendations from this group in 20 were very favorable to have a floor for predictability purposes. I mean, a lot of this is about budget predictability, and without some further tweaks, it causes issues in regard to budget predictability. But I think maybe the most important thing that the model has done is to focus on certain metrics, all metrics, but certain metrics, especially, and to manage our respective institutions toward improving our respective institutions based on these metrics. It's been a vital part of our strategic planning process. It's included in our strategic plan, these particular metrics and how we're doing on these metrics. So we use it often. We use it to improve our institutions, and these are guideposts. And I think that's worked well. The issues of some negatives is new dollars in our respective budgets. So from a predictability and a budgeting process, there's very few dollars, even with, and we're very grateful to the new appropriations put in the performance funding model, but you can't really budget for it because it goes in the model, it comes out of the model, then you get it, it goes through the model again, you get it back. So that amount's going to change for every institution every year to some degree. And one of the ideas that we many of us have talked about, maybe all of us have talked about, is putting some amount of the new performance dollars into the base. And Dr. Zarpata mentioned the same thing, where everyone can win to some level. We still have 2 institutions and at least 4 community colleges that are not participating in a performance funding process. So what happens is, without this type of predictability, without knowing what the dollars are, and with limited tuition dollars, I think the last few years has been about a 1.5% tuition raise. I mean, we're not keeping up with inflation.
1.3 actually.
Yeah, 1.3 plus. We're not keeping up with inflation. So what that does is it causes many of us, maybe not all of us, but many of us to actually annually cut our budgets, cut programs, cut budgets. We have to retain faculty. We must reward faculty. We've got to make sure our programs are performing at the highest level. Academic quality issues are at play. Accreditation issues are at play here for each of us as well. Bless you. Again, I want to say this, we're grateful. The redistribution process that we eliminated a couple of years ago has made a huge difference. For Murray State University, one year, the year that we had to give back into the model, $850,000+ was a tremendous financial and budgeting burden on the institution. We couldn't come up with that other than by cutting pretty severely into our budget. So we gave back 2%. Some other quick concerns. I know everyone's got different thoughts, but many are very similar. Is the environment we're in today, the inflationary environment we're in today, we have to take into consideration some form of fashion from the standpoint of both faculty, staff, employee raises, number one. Our people, our most important asset that we have from a teaching and learning standpoint, from an academic quality standpoint, all of us are constantly losing people to other institutions. And so we've got to respond to that component from the standpoint of retaining and recruiting new faculty as well. I mentioned maintaining program quality and accreditations for these different programs. I mean, you cannot continue cutting at our respective institutions as we have been for the last few years. Some of us have cut pretty deep. And even with this performance funding model, we're still having to cut at pretty high levels. I promised Chair Tipton a few weeks ago when I met with him, I wouldn't mention this anymore, but I'm sorry, I'm going to mention it again.
You're forgiven.
Pensions for some of us are still a factor that eats up part of our budget. And that number continues to grow, and it will for the next 5 years. So whatever new money is allocated in the performance funding model, the pension allocation amounts that have been distributed to each of us are taking up a big chunk of that money as well. So I'll close with this. I think one recommendation that I would suggest that we consider is, how do we take some amount of money, 3 million, 4 million, some amount of money of what is allocated in the performance funding model, and allocate it to a base where everyone has an open the door amount in order that we can take care of our faculty and staff, address inflationary issues, and move forward in a positive way. So, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you.
Thompson, thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Ron, we're going to take a virtual person, so you can go next, sir.
Okay, thank you. And too bad I couldn't be there physically, but you know, this month we've had 2 board meetings, and so it's kind of hard to maneuver. I'll see you on Thursday though. I'd like to just begin by saying that we really seek to have a performance-based funding model that is built on a level playing field. There are a number of issues, some have already been mentioned, especially those associated with just trying to keep faculty staff who are overworked and underpaid staying when they know that state workers got some kind of increase relative to inflation, and the public universities are state enterprises effectively and nothing. But I would like to talk about more specifically 3 areas. Well, actually 4. The 4th one I'll start at the beginning. One of the challenges with the model is that the model basically doesn't have a gearing factor that fundamentally ties to the reality of the institutions that are asked to provide the service, which means, in simple language, it's not sufficiently funded. And then on top of that, because of the way it's structured, volatility does create havoc. The way the model is sort of formulated in terms of thinking about it is as if the public institutions are a utility, and utilities have a relatively well-known or bounded revenue stream. And as a result, utilities can actually have a lot of debt because they can actually look at their revenue stream against the debt service, and they can actually make good decisions. Organizations that have high variability can't have a lot of debt. And to be quite honest, universities have tons of debt, even though it may not be on their balance sheet as debt. Faculty, they have to be paid. The facilities have to be taken care of. Those are actually debts. And when you have a volatility in your revenue stream, you put the institution into a serious bind, continuous cutting, which then means your performance actually declines. So that's the first one. The second is the starting point for the institutions has got to be better addressed. It requires due diligence, a due diligence assessment of each institution at their starting point. For example, deferred maintenance is not the same, especially in operational areas. Another example, new technology that's needed to attract and keep students. Some places have it because they also have federal funds and all the rest of that. others don't. In addition, there are deferrals. I mean, I come here and I find that, that the budget this year is hit by a deferral of FICA and Social Security from COVID. And where's that money coming from? So the starting point, we need to actually do real due diligence to understand what's going on at the institutions rather than coming down with a top-down strategy. Next, what counts? There's language throughout that talks about what matters. And ultimately, the Commonwealth, correctly so, believes that its competitive advantage comes from having a more, not just educated, but more technologically prepared population. And so this spring, we have 476 dual credit students. Why does that count? We have 1/3 of our students transferred to other institutions who get the credit because we got them started. Well, why doesn't that count? Next, the formula itself, that I just believe that there should be a bigger, small university adjustment or a bigger foundational component, meaning a certain share that comes and it's allocated to the institutions so that without having the performance component. Performance actually requires thinking about this a different way. That if the performance is based on only on your past, then, and you are in an environment with volatility in terms of your funding and you don't know, you're losing people because of inflation and all the rest of that, then you can never actually catch up. It's just designed for the ones who are ahead and who have reserves to continue to at least make it through, and the other ones always being left behind. So I would just say that the whole process needs to really be thought through in the context of what the Commonwealth is actually seeking to achieve. And if it's seeking to achieve what it says, then a number of the items that I've talked about and also have just been referenced would be considered.
Thank you, Ron. Benita?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. I think I'll start by using the phrase "I'm drinking from a fire hose," as this is my day 6. But I'm excited to share about the impact that the model has had at NKU. We are guided by our strategic framework, which is Success by Design, which is singularly focused on student success, and it aligns with the strategic goal of the 60 by 30 plan. And also, it also aligns with the performance funding. Success by Design is our North Star. And so again, we are really focused on student success and moving our region and the state forward. Some examples of some of the things we've been able to do. We've implemented something called our first year experience hub, where we're focusing on our first year students who are generally first generation and low income. And so we're wrapping those supports around them. The funding has been extremely useful in us being able to implement that and other student support services. So I will say we all know our students are coming with more needs, with different needs, and to support those needs, does require funding. Our STEM H programs have also grown exponentially over time, and we've expanded those programs and added capacity and created lab space, provided more flexible needs. As a result, NKU has performed well in the performance funding model. Its stated outcomes are consequential in advancing the Commonwealth's economy and incentivizing us to meet its needs. As we walk through this process, however, I hope that remains our common goal as well. We serve a unique population. We have a high proportion of first generation students, underrepresented minority students, and many of our students are working full time to pursue their education. Again, that's going to have an impact on our enrollment in the future as the economy does better. Students typically don't want to go to school. And so we want to look at how that impacts us in this model. More than 60% of our students are enrolled in STEM or health-related fields. Further, we are growing our enrollment in cybersecurity, data management, supply chain, in other words, that are responsive to our region and our needs. And as we all know, we talk about building the state and the economy. 82% of our graduates stay in the Northern Kentucky region. And again, that's pretty much all I know at this point, but I look forward to engaging in this conversation further.
Thank you. Well, we're gonna let myself and the representatives and budget director come last. We'll listen to presidents first.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Well, good morning. From Morehead State's perspective, we believe the performance funding model has driven positive outcomes for the state, positive outcomes and decision-making on our campus. So I want to state that up front. However, it's no secret that Morehead State University is not fared well at all. And by our records, our financial records and otherwise, since 2017, we have lost 10% of our base. And in addition to losing 10% of our base, which we can't budget off of, we did not gain any money this current year when other institutions got millions of dollars. We got zero. And as it is currently slated for the model, whether it's in statute or non-statute policy, we're slated not to receive any money again for the second year of the biennium, which is next budget year. So not only have we lost 10% of our base in 5.5 years, we've not gained any money in this most recent influx of dollars in the higher ed total appropriation, the $75 million appropriation. So we feel like we've kind of taken it on both sides of the can. In addition, we've done our fair share of the cuts to try to accommodate this, along with absorbing inflationary factors and other things, just like everyone else. So our red pen is running out of ink a little bit. The second bullet talks about the stop loss specifically, and as many of you who are familiar with the model know, Morehead State benefited by the stop loss two-ish or 3 years ago. Had it not been for that stop loss, our losses would have been catastrophic as a small school. So we are appreciative of the stop loss in the model. Despite the stop loss, we've lost 10% of our base. As far as pressing concerns going forward, one, we are very thankful this conversation's taking place, even though it's going to take a while through this calendar year. We hope that there will be some consideration for schools like us that, number one, kept tuition low. By public policy, we either froze tuition or kept tuition low, but yet we also didn't gain any money anywhere in the model or the additional dollars for 6 years. So we're reaching a point where we think that there needs to be not only a mathematical look at the model, but also a public policy look at the model, because Morehead State by region, our 22 county service region, serves the highest poverty rate in the state of Kentucky, the highest, a very high FAFSA Pell rate. And so our region brings with it some unique needs that are not found in other regions that might have more tuition increase absorption. We simply just cannot raise tuition and put it on the backs of students that have the highest poverty rate in the state. We believe that's not a mathematical decision, that's a public policy decision that the state needs to undertake, not only with this group, but also in the governor's office and in the General Assembly. So we're hoping for a forward look in this model that number one, brings some type of base adjustment. Just like the rest of the colleagues around the table, we have inflationary costs as well. Not only have we been cutting our way into covering inflationary costs, we have little to no ability to raise tuition and recoup any of those dollars for year-over-year operating dollars. So much like President Jackson and others have stated, some type of adjustment in the model going forward, maybe money off the top that goes to just cover inflationary cost increases would be nice. Something that we can count on, because if you look at the mathematics of the model, Morehead State University is not going to win, period. You run the model any way you want to run it, but when you have a model that is full of weights and volume, some schools will never win. No matter how you run the model, unless the model significantly changes, our institution's not moving. And even this July 1, started the second year of the biennium, the 75 million that's been put in the higher ed funding formula, zero for Morehead State again. So here we go again for another year of no funding for our university. So I would argue on behalf of our institution, we have a mathematical formula to look at and to discuss, but we also should talk about public policy piece of the model as well. Who do each of our regions serve? What's the affordability of our institutions? And how can we work with some of the smaller institutions that are very integral in serving some of the regions that sometimes get overlooked in other measures. So, Leader, I'll pause with that.
Thank you, Jay. Lori.
Thank you, Aaron. I appreciate it. I want to thank the members of the General Assembly here for the increased funding. It made a difference on our campus. Overall, the funding model has made us have more of a laser focus on the metrics that matter, which are student retention and graduation. And because the model is here to stay and it's in statute and not just something that people can say, well, if we wait it out, it will go away. It's allowed us to really engage the deans and our employees in a different way. I mean, we're the ones who will determine our own destiny by our efforts in student success. So that's really wonderful. And then it's allowed us to link the strategic plan, our budget model, and the performance funding in a way that we can plan to the degree that we can to make sure our students make it across the finish line. Our challenges, I'll talk about this in just a minute, but it's very complicated. The model is very complicated. And so when we're trying to explain it on campus, it gets muddy and it kind of lost in translation, I will say. And then just to echo my presidential colleagues, the uncertainty year to year and what's at risk and what we're going to do allows us not to really plan ahead very much. We can't do that, and we can't put much money at risk. We've been fortunate enough to get money in the funding model, but the fact that it's one-time money changes how we can plan to use it a little bit. The other thing that it does is it pits us against each other. And, you know, I believe that Kentucky is strong when all our public institutions are strong. I'm going to fight tooth and nail for resources for University of Louisville because that's where I am. But we need all our schools to be strong because students choose the best fit. And we want to make sure workforce development happens across our entire Commonwealth. But this does pit us against each other in a competitive way, rather than looking at how we are doing against ourselves. That would allow us to look at resources that are maybe not as robust at some institution, but are they moving the metrics forward? So the change that happened in 2020 let us be more strategic and long-term in our planning, and that's always something good. Without it, just like our colleagues are saying, we were having to deal with budget cuts every year, but to get a base funding for us removed a lot of the uncertainty. And then so the General Assembly members, Givens and Tipton, will be shocked at this next statement. We support increasing base funding levels based on increases in state appropriations. Our base funding model, excluding the performance model, is lower now than it was from 2008 to 2017. There's been a lot of things happening in our world that plays into that, but that's something that we're doing with more students and those kinds of factors. And even with this additional performance funding, we received about 24 million more in state support in 08 than we did this year. So that's another concern just about moving forward in the future. So I think that if we look at the model, there are 11 variables, and the question is, can we limit those numbers of variables that may not be the ones that really determine if a school's moving forward or not? it's hard to explain to our community. And so we can't always positively address every one of the metrics to make a difference. If we had fewer variables that were really focused on those high priority goals like low income, underrepresented students, Pell eligible students, all those might be considered as the important thing. Number of degrees. Those are the things that make Kentucky strong. And then I know there's conversations about pulling UK and U of L out and having the regionals in. We don't support that. We think we all should stay in the same pool as public institutions. And then one thought we had was rewarding improvement on each metric instead of just a relative to the sector average. So look, is that school improving? Are they moving forward in the metrics rather than they didn't move forward as much as school X? So if we looked at things like that, I think it would be that we would see changes in all the schools, and then it would also give us the drive even more to move forward. So one tiny comment I will make, some of the comments have been to add credentials and count those. And while I'm in support of that, I think we would need a statewide model that equated credentials across a micro credential, a certificate, a badge, that kind of language. So my school doesn't have 1,000 badges that were just 2 hours of work, not credit hours, and somebody else has a badge that's 20 hours. So we have some sort of range and some sort of statewide standard for what those would be. Thank you.
Thank you, Lori. President McFadden.
What else is there to say now? Let me say this first to our elected officials and folks who are joining us. As we look around the table, community colleges, our four-year institutions, I hope that you find and NCPE as partners in that we are good partners, that during a period of time in which we have navigated through a global pandemic, that we have navigated record inflation, and frankly, prior to this year, a period of time where we did not have any resources to do the work that we do, we have seen more credentials, reduced time to credentials. We've seen more access and greater affordability of higher education in the state. And I think that's a great testament to the teamwork of everyone around this table. And so we've seen success in a lot of ways. And I think we should celebrate that success. As it relates to the model and to the inputs, I think that a lot of the things that we're looking at are the things that we should be, that others are looking at, federal agencies are looking at. When we look at graduation rates, when we look at degrees conferred, when we look at progression and retention and all of those inputs, those are things we must be looking at, because I think if we're not performing our fiduciary duty. I do think that the model is complicated. As President Gonzalez said, it is hard to take this out to your general faculty and staff and explain why some get more and why some get less, because it is a complicated model. Even if you're seeing your retention rates go up, even if you're seeing more degrees conferred, because of the volume-based nature of the metric and the weightings inside the model, it is complicated and it is challenging in that way. I will say the funding floor that was established was absolutely paramount. I don't think we knew what we were entering into with the pandemic ahead, but it was absolutely paramount that we had that funding floor in place. And that has given stability to a model that was one of a kind, being 100% all funds into a performance-based funding model. So I commend the group for this. Ideas that are on my mind, things that are circling around. As President Gonzalez highlighted, I think we've got to talk about sectors, and we've got to talk about mission, and what is the mission of each institution here. And even within the sectors that we are in, there are unique missions, and I think those need to be accounted for. I think we must take a look at the weightings, and we must understand what is it we're trying to achieve. I wasn't a president at the time, but was a part of this process from beginning to end. And the post-secondary credentialing at the associate's and baccalaureate degree were the driving force behind this model. Getting to 60 by 30, rewarding baccalaureate degree attainment for the four-year institutions was what we were trying to achieve. And I think we're well on our way to doing that. I do think we have to have some efficiency measures in here, that looking at being efficient, being good stewards of those resources, how we use our spaces, how we deploy our human capital. We've got to have a way to measure that. And I think there has to be some normalizing that happens through some of the data, whether that's using some FTE calculations, but we're gonna have to normalize some of this data, I think, in order to adjust the model so that we can go forward and all be fully supportive of it. I think that one thing I would challenge us to do as we go through this process is to reverse engineer, what it is we want to accomplish? What are the things that we want from the institutions that are sitting here today in order to power Kentucky's economy, to be able to make sure that we are an attractive place for investment for employers, that we are a place that people are choosing to come and get a degree and are staying and being a part of our communities here in Kentucky. And I think our universities are doing a great job of that. As we look at now for one of the last states to be able to try to reinvest during a period of downturn, I think that our universities and our community colleges give a great return on investment to Commonwealth of Kentucky. And we're excited to talk more about that in this process. And I want to say big thanks to Aaron through this process, all the processes, the work to support all of us. And as I sit here, I've got to represent EKU, but a healthy post-secondary system in Kentucky is going to make for a healthy Kentucky.
Thank you, David. Eli.
Oh, thank you, and good morning, everyone. Since I've been around this table, in terms of presidents, the longest, reflect back on when I arrived in Kentucky, we had a simple but powerful motto, which was strong by degree. And it made sense then, and it makes sense now. I think there's a strong correlation with the simple measurement that says the more educated individuals you have with bachelor or associate degrees, the better prepared you are to create jobs and attract jobs. So when I looked at the model, despite some of its complexities, and also recall that we looked at models from across the country, I would say they are inherently complex. They have to be to make some of the adjustments that people are talking about. I think ours is in some ways reasonably simple in terms of what are the indicators that one can share with those who need to deliver on these things to create focus. I think it's important to smooth out the measures, which I think we do in many ways. I think it is important that models are enduring. To move graduation rates takes an accumulation of effort and interventions. They do not happen overnight. Dramatic changes in a model that shift the indicators, they can undermine that kind of sustained effort. It has worked on our campus to reinforce what we tell people are the values of their fellow citizens in Kentucky. We want more graduates to enroll, incur less debt, finish in a shorter amount of time, and be prepared for lives of meaning and purpose. Compared to 10 years ago, our first year in graduating classes is nearly double. The time of degree has shortened. We have a North Star for our campus that says this is what the state of Kentucky expects of us, so it has helped reinforce what is and should be central to a university. And I do look forward to looking more closely at the model. My understanding of it at the beginning was that in many ways, you were competing against yourself. And I will say, as a university that was stubbornly stuck at a 60% graduation rate for a decade ago. And this year, it's more work. We'll now go to a 70% graduation rate. There are only 100 or so universities across the country like ours that achieve that level. There are lots of reasons for that. It gets harder with more success when you're competing against yourself. And I think in some ways the model has some of those components. It'll be good to take fresh eyes on it again and understand what any adjustments we made. And I think any adjustments we made should be compared against what we have today.
Thank you. Last president before we speak up.
Well, since everyone has said everything, I will be brief. I will echo my colleagues' thanks for the investment in the model. I think is an important turning point for the Commonwealth and good for all of us to have resources. And it's the bottom line. The KU is obviously also one in the model. But I think that as we go through the conversation, for me, it's important. While absolutely, I have an obligation of representing our campus, our campuses, that thinking about this more holistically and taking off that institutional hat, thinking about public policy from the Commonwealth's perspective is something that I hope to do. On our campus, it has focused conversations as well around retention and graduation rates, the way that otherwise probably would not have happened. And we have seen similar success in the number of students who are returning and graduating over time. I think inherent in the model, if you think about it philosophically, there is a perpetual growth component, and the context in which we're working. I think we should take a look at, at some point, where is that ceiling? What does that look in terms of our population? And we know that the college going rate, unfortunately, anything after high school has gone from 57 to 47%. And so in that context, does the model actually perform the way we would have hoped if the perspective was growth in perpetuity? So I want us to have that conversation as well. I do think it's important that folks have an opportunity to win. Is it fair that we've built a model where institutions have zero chance to be rewarded, even though they're having success from some metrics? And so we have that conversation. In terms of specifics, I think number one, and I agree with David, that there's an efficiency component that we need to think about. More and just more is probably not as strategic as doing more with less. And I think that the way in which the model is built right now, that doesn't really get taken into account. And the last thing is that in terms of the national landscape for performance funding, and I spent a lot of time in the state to our south, when they went through the first iteration, and they were among the first in the nation to do it, the transition from performance funding 1.0 to performance funding 2.0 really did create opportunities for institutions to differentiate themselves from everyone else in the model. And so I think we should have a conversation around each of us have different missions necessarily, and we'll pursue things that others in the Commonwealth might not pursue. And an example for us is we want to grow our research portfolio. We're right about 30, we want to get to 50. Eli has 10 times that amount of research, but in some ways it's not built into what we get rewarded for. And each of us on our campuses has things that we've said are institutional goals. And I think there has to be acknowledgement of that. At the end of the day, good for the Commonwealth. In a time of great uncertainty, lots of transition, and unexpected challenges, we've managed to grow the number of folks getting degrees and credentials in the state. And that is a tremendous, tremendous win for us. Last thing is, I know this is about post-secondary education, but if there were a way to incentivize our K-12 colleagues to have more of their high school graduates going to college, I think that also would change
some of the metrics that we have to deal with, over which we have limited control because they're not yet our students. So with that, I look forward to the conversation. It will be a fun intellectual and practical exercise.
Aaron, may I say one thing? It's already been said, but those of you around the table, and thank you for all of us who were around the table then, were quite concerned if we introduced this without new money. And if I'm not mistaken, we were the only state in the states we looked at, there were about 16 of them, that did introduce performance funding without new money. And I agree with what my colleagues have said. That scenario set up a zero-sum game with losses, and to make improvements, you got to have some hope of earning dollars, and you got to have time to spend those dollars, make an impact. So I understood, respected why we did it then, but I think it has made it collectively.
Absolutely. I will save my statewide perspective to last. I was going to go to Budget Director Hicks first, but I don't see him, so I'm going to go to you, Representative Tim.
Thank you, Mr. President. I was not part of the original work group, but I got brought onto the team very late in the process. Senator Gibbons' bill, I worked with him, and I was assigned the task of carrying that in the House. So I got a crash course on the performance-based funding model back in 17. I will say I've been very interested in watching how the process, the metrics, the dynamics have played out. I've looked at the data, the statistics. One thing that has puzzled me is that the model has generated very good response to growth of underrepresented minority. However, we're not seeing that growth and students are economically disadvantaged. And that has really concerned me. That's something I think we need to look at as we develop through the model. If you remember, when we did this in 2020, we were in the middle of COVID. To a certain extent, we were disadvantaged. We were working remotely, so we weren't in a group setting like this. But I've been listening to the comments by the presidents. Some of those comments I've heard before in my office when they come to see me, but I appreciate them re-emphasizing those today. And I'm open to a conversation. I think it's important for us as we look at these different ideas. Bill does a great job of doing models for us, prospective models. So I think it's going to be very important to look at the data and discuss the policy and discuss the math and what's best for the state of Kentucky, for our citizens, and how can we help all universities succeed in their mission.
Thank you, sir. Last but not least, Senator Gibbons.
Aaron, friends, good morning. Thanks for the chance to be on briefly, and I'm gonna share some remarks, and then I may have to step away for another meeting that's getting ready to start. I want to start with a word of sincere appreciation to each of you, starting with the university presidents. For those of you in the leadership roles that you play, and the tasks that you have that are so many, and the seriousness that you bring to this conversation is something I truly appreciate. I cannot express enough the importance of post-secondary education in Kentucky and the impact it has on our Commonwealth for years to come, our economy, our state revenues, our incarceration rates, our Medicaid costs, all of those pieces fit together, and education is the glue that impacts almost every one of those pieces. So thanks for your leadership in that space. And again, rolling up sleeves, this is a process for those of us that have been through it a couple of times. This is truly a rolling up your sleeves sort of process. And you can sense already a lot of honesty around the table, future tension that we're going to be running headlong into, and that's inherent in this process. So you will get to enjoy and see some sides of people that maybe you don't often get to see. Call it enjoyment, entertainment, whatever you may wish to call it. But again, I want to start with that word of appreciation directed to the university presidents, then to the CPE folks, because as a legislator that helped to launch this endeavor, but for the Bevin administration that was committed to it at the time, and but for CPE's willingness to be the stick that sort of herded all of us in the right direction, we wouldn't be here. So Aaron, to you and to Bill and Sean and all those that have been involved for so long, sincere appreciation for that. Now, moving briefly through some thoughts and reflections on what I've heard each of you say. For those of you that haven't been traveling on this journey for so long, it always helps to understand that we were moving from a shares model that had no attention whatsoever to performance. It was the size of the pie. What was the percentage of the pie that you got previously in the past? That's how much you're going to get again. And so respectfully, for a lot of our institutions that have faced challenges around earnings under this model, I say respectfully, and you know this, you were being overfunded in the old shares model based on FTEs and performance. Now, we've gone long enough, and Bill can confirm this better than I, but we've gone long enough through the model that we've normalized that at this point. So we're no longer trying to level up that playing field. But let's all acknowledge that we started from a place of overfunding underperforming systems. Now, this 60 by 30 goal was something that we've talked a lot about and we continue to talk about. And I'm so pleased to have heard each of you, university presidents, use the word focus. I've heard it over and over and over from almost from each one of you. The word focus means that it's driving what your institution is doing, and that was the goal. This is about degree attainment. This is about trying to hit those targets that they are rather complex in the formula, but obviously it's moving the needle in the right direction based on our trajectory towards 60 by 30. One or two last thoughts. I feel like going forward, and someone touched on this just a moment ago. It may have been President Caboni or President McFadden. Our greatest challenges are external. This model is vitally important, and this process is going to help us get it as right as we can get it. It'll never be perfect, but I love the iterative nature of what we're doing every 3 years, sitting down, going through this again. But our greatest challenges are going to be external. That college going rate that President Caboni touched on, that is our biggest looming challenge. How do we find a way to move the needle on what I call cultural bias toward post-secondary education that still remains in parts of Kentucky? We've got to move the way that post-secondary education is perceived. We've got to continue this access challenge, be it a physical access or a financial access challenge. But overall, we've got to continue driving the message forward, all of us as ambassadors for post-secondary education, about that perceived value, that post-secondary degree. It's just so vitally important that we continue, as we have our internal tension in this room, that we always lead with the unified voice of challenging all of our young people and our adults. Go back and get that next degree, get that next credential, get that piece that makes you valuable in the workforce. Last quick thought I'll share is Bill, I've heard a lot of conversation. For those of you that haven't been on the journey again, and we do sound like we're old sea sailors, and we're not. Eli and others that have been through this. For those of you that haven't seen it, Bill is a spreadsheet guru, and you are going to be stunned. You think it's complex now here in this first meeting. When he starts whipping out and rolling out and tweaking this and doing that, it's impressive, and we've got to have that talent, Bill, of you doing that. But the challenge I'm going to put to you, Bill, is somewhere along the way, maybe in one of the next couple of meetings, it might be worth us doing a true layman's 30,000-foot view. Don't get us too deep in the weeds, but I've heard multiple folks on the call say, we're trying to take this to our faculty and deconstruct it, and it's a little too complex. If we could say these are the 4 or 5 key trends that drive key outcomes, and don't even get into the complexity of the formula, but just say, this is causing this, this is causing this, this is causing this, and we see it over and over and over, it may be time well spent. So again, I look forward to the conversations, appreciate again the dedication of everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Gibbons. We do have an elevator speech, so Bill will be able to give it. If not, I'm sure Sean will, all right? Let me tell you from a statewide perspective, what I know and what we've seen. Now, I want to be careful to say the performance funding model from a public policy viewpoint at CPE is one of several driving pieces, right? One strategic agenda, 60 by 30. The other, it would be our other policies like the diversity policy and so on. So I imagine this as centering this. So what do we know about the model? Well, it's working. We have, since the model's been implemented, we've only had a 0.6 enrollment increase, partially because we've had a 10-point decrease in college going. And we've had adult learners not leaving the system. We've had more degrees. We've had more credentials, Paul, from your units. We have higher retention rates at all of our institutions, significant at KCPCS, but among all of us, most of our four-year institutions, except for one, and except for the last COVID year where we dipped a little bit, are at 80%. I mean, who could have ever imagined that in Kentucky, right? Our time to degree is lower. We're just a little over 4 years now. We used to talk about a 6 year. Now we're talking about a point or two over 4 years. So we've decreased that. We've decreased it in our community colleges. That's way now closer to 2 years than the 3+ years that it was. Where grad rates are up significantly. Let me be clear, we're at 50.5% educational attainment now in Kentucky. Now, that's going to slow down for a lot of reasons. COVID, it's going to slow down because we don't have people going to college in Kentucky. And we're going to address that, and I can talk about that later as much as we can from a public policy viewpoint. But we're going to have to look at some other changes to the model to help us to get there. We're creating more innovative programs. I had a chance to look at our programs, those that many of you dropped, those that you're putting in, clearly looking toward the future of Kentucky. We close gaps as fast or faster than any other state with our URN. Some of the issues, though, that I will take, by the way, I should throw it in, Bill has a slide where Kentucky now is number 2 in output of completion. We are tied with Utah. Once again, this is a huge jump over the last many years. So we're proud of all of that. And we know that performance funding model is driving a lot of that. Some issues that I see from a public policy or CPE viewpoint, we've got to have more money that's consistent to go to keeping our talent. We're going to run into a talent issue if we haven't already. That's just bottom. If you can't budget for talent, you won't have talent. If you can't budget to put a level of student success baseline in place, you're not going to grow. You're going to get farther behind because it takes resources with the wraparound services. And let's be clear, I'm going to say this, not a put down to anyone. We not only have a low college going rate, many of our students graduating from high school are now probably not as prepared as they once were. I mean, these are all issues that higher education has to take control of once we get it, right? So that takes money to do it. That takes those wraparound services. Mental health is on the rise. The mental health issues, all kinds of stuff that you already know about. I won't go into detail. So we have to think about how does the model help us to address that. We have low income. We have an issue. We've got to figure out how. I'm a Clay County boy, and I've been in higher education almost 35 years in Kentucky, and I have to tell you, except for a few years in Missouri, I have to tell you that this is an issue that is growing by leaps and bounds. It's always been an issue, but it's one that's growing. So when we talk about the value proposition, I just want to make sure we don't leave anybody out of this. If not, it's going to cost the state in other ways, whether it's Medicaid, whether it's incarceration. I keep on going. You know all this already. You know, we also have to look at what does it mean to have our connection to the workforce, adult learners. Key issue for me, what it should be for the state. How do we incentivize the increase there? Down the road, we need to look at a few more efficiency measures. We need to look at quality metrics. All of these things have to be the way we consider from a statewide perspective. So I appreciate once again the idea, and I'll add on to what everybody else has said, the campuses have taken this seriously. We work together, David, you're absolutely right. In unison, we haven't always agreed, but we did. And the other thing too, we've had a 1.3 average, am I right, 1.3? Average tuition increase over this time. So we know it may be hard this time because of the inflationary mark, and there's not money going into some of our campuses. But the last thing I'll say, if we think that all of our campuses are important, if we think that if you're from Eastern Kentucky, Jay, or Big Sandy, or out in Henderson, all of those, we have to consider how we are not only not including them in a equitable sense, but how we need to make sure that this works. The last thing I will say, we are at funding parity except for KSU. So we have reached that base. Jay, I think you're $1 or $2 below, but still, we have issues that's holding on to some of this hold harmless and other things that we need to talk about during this time. So from a statewide perspective, that's the way we are approaching this but anxious to hear more about what we're going to talk about. And for Bill, I think we've left you, 45 minutes to do the rest of it?
And we'll try not to use all of that time.
There you go.
Heather, if you'll get the PowerPoint back up. Thank you. As President Thompson said, we've got about 45 minutes and maybe 35 or 40 slides. And so we're going to skip over some of these so that we can get to the most important slides, which are the distributions and impact section, and then also the student outcome section. I will just tell you what's in this background information section. Heather, it's not looking. Okay, thank you. And rather than read through these questions, I'll just flip through the slides quickly. What was the impetus for the model? I think most of you already know what the factors were that caused the working group to come together and produce the model. The number one item is that first bullet. We were legislatively mandated in House Bill 303 to convene the working group and develop the model. There were some other factors as well. You can read those on your own. I do think it's important to make people aware that the initial post-secondary education working group did have an overarching goal, and this was that goal: develop a funding model that aligns state funding for higher education operations with desired state policy goals and appropriately reflects differences in missions among campuses. We've got 2 slides in here that contain some of the guiding principles that the working group used to help develop the model. These principles were referred to time and time again during that 5 or 6 month process back in 2016. Again, you can read through those on your own, but those were vitally important. I think all of you are aware of the desired state goals for the funding model at KCTCS and the public university model. Those state goals are listed there. I do want to take just a couple of minutes on 2 slides that have to do with the major decision points that the initial working group had to deal with back in 2016. There were a number of critical decisions that the working group had to reach consensus around in order to construct the model. Right off the bat, what type of model did we want to adopt? Should it be a target and goals approach? Should it be outcomes based? As you can see by the green check mark, the working group decided on an outcomes-based model. Do we want to have 3 sectors or 3 funding models or 2 models? In other words, do we want to keep the research and comprehensive sectors separate or have them together in one funding model? Again, the decision was made to keep them together. What should be the major components in the funding model? And we're going to talk, Sean's going to talk about that here in just a minute, a couple of slides ahead. The component weights be 35% student success, 35% course completion, 10% for each of the operational support components is where we ended up. What should the metrics be that are included in the model? What should the weights be for those metrics or the allocation percentages? Decisions had to be made about degree types, premiums for certain populations of students. What thresholds for student progression? What should the operational support metrics be? An example is in the degree type metric. Should we include all degrees or bachelor's only within the university model? At KCTCS, should it be all credentials or should it just be associate degrees? In terms of the metric weights, those were graduated to emphasize completion. You'll see that here in just a minute. Another major decision, should we use counts or volumes or should we use rates? And these are just two examples. Should we count the number of degrees produced or should we use graduation rates? Should we count the number of credit hours earned at different student progression thresholds or should we use a retention rate? And the number was, the decision made by the working group was to use the counts of degrees and counts of credit hours earned. In the earned credit hour component, should we count all credit hours or just undergraduate or undergraduate and graduate? In the end, the only thing that was not counted were high school credit hours. This next decision point, a lot of time was spent discussing what should the weighting be for non-resident student credit hours earned. A number of working group members wanted non-resident students to count 0 in the funding model. Others wanted the credit hours to count 100%. 50% is where we ended up. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Sean to go through some of the components and metrics in the model.
This is a look at the main components of the model, the metrics, and how they were developed by the working group. This slide should look familiar. These are the 5 main components. The outcomes-based components are the green and yellow. The student success components at 35%, and the course completion credit hours earned at 35%. So together, that's 70% of the model, and then 30% of the model is for operational support, maintenance and operations, institutional support, and academic support, and of course, maintenance and operations. The distribution is based on square footage of education in general space, excluding labs. Institutional support, that distribution was based on the share of spending on instruction and student services rather than spending on administrative and institutional support. The working group thought that was an appropriate way to distribute those funds. And then finally, academic support based on share of FTE student enrollment. And we were asked why were those percentages chosen? And to a great extent, it's because if you look at the functional expense categories at our institutions in fiscal year 20, you can see about 70% of the funding was of education and related expenditures were spent on instruction and student services.
Or direct costs of educating students.
Direct costs of educating students, about 70%. And that correlates to that 70% of outcomes-based funding, maintenance and operations at 11%, institutional support at 10%, and academic support at 12%. So very, very close alignment. And we just adjusted the numbers slightly so that it was a little easier to understand. This is a reminder of the weights that are used, the allocation percentages that are used in the model. So you see that student success at the university at 35%, at the university model at 35%. And you can see that the progression thresholds 30, 60, 90, and then ultimately a bachelor's degree, the weighting increases. It's graduated to emphasize completion, 3, 5, 7, 9%. KCTCS, you also see 35% student success, of course, and operational support at universities, and at KCTCS also at 30%. Let's see, did I have anything on this? I think all that's, I think I covered all of it.
Well, just quickly, the main objectives of the working group in selecting the metrics and the allocation percentages for those metrics were to align those metrics with the desired state goals, but also we looked at a number of metrics that were commonly used in other states, and so we selected similar metrics. And as Sean already mentioned, we assigned progressively greater weight to further a student progress toward completion. But vitally important, we wanted to provide premiums for high priority populations, and that would be STEM plus H degrees, degrees awarded to underrepresented minority students, and degrees awarded to low-income students. Just quickly, in terms of the model mechanics, I thought it might be helpful to share, what is the formula base, how is it calculated, what are the allocable resources run through the model, how are those calculated, what was the small school adjustment, how was that determined, and then what are the basic mechanics of the funding model. And I'm probably not going to go through all of these slides, but I'll go through 3 or 4 of them. The first step is to calculate the allocable resources that are going to be run through the funding model. And these next 3 or 4 slides are just for the public university funding model, not the KCTCS model. But you start in column A with the enacted general fund appropriation for the current year. You back out in column B the adjustments, any adjustments to the general fund, and in 2022-23, that's debt service that's being backed out. You back out mandated programs in column C, and then highlighted in pink is what we call the adjusted net general fund. In the performance funding statute, that is referred to as the formula base. If you take the formula base and then back out the small school adjustment in column E, then highlighted in yellow are the allocable resources that are actually run through the performance funding model, in this case, the public university model. And you can see the total there, it's $527.9 million. So if you look at the very bottom of this slide, the total allocable resources, 100%, $527.9 million. Well, what do we do with those allocable resources? Well, the first step is we assign those allocable resources to component funding pools. And as Sean said, there's 5 major components. You can see those listed on the left. The allocation percentages are highlighted in yellow. If you apply those percentages to the total allocable resources, we can divide that 527 million up into component funding pools. So the student success funding pool was roughly $185 million. The next step is to take that $185 million and allocate it to the student success metrics. And again, on the left-hand side of the slide, you can see progression at 30, 60, 90, total bachelor's degrees, and then STEM plus H, URM, and low-income bachelor's degrees. The allocation percentages are highlighted in yellow. If you apply those percentages to the total 527.9 million, you determine student success metric pools in that second column of numbers. And if you add those up, it adds back to that roughly 185 million in that student success metric pool. Now, this is really the crux of how the model works. And this is looking only at the bachelor's degree funding pool. Total of $47,509,300 was allocated in 2022-23 to the bachelor's degree funding pool. We look at the weighted degrees produced at each institution. That's the first column of numbers. And then highlighted by the green thick border is the percent share of total. We get a percent share of total and multiply those percentages by the bachelor's degree funding pool amount of 47.5 million. And then we can calculate the distribution of that bachelor's degree funding pool by institution. And that's shown in that second or that last column of numbers on the right. This percent share total approach is performed on all metrics. There's 11 metrics in the funding model, and that approach is used on all of the metrics.
Bill,
Yes.
would you go back one slide, please? I have a question around. When you weight by a degree per 100 FTE to promote efficiency, what does that mean and how does it promote efficiency?
Basically, we take the number of degrees produced and divide it by each 100 FTE students. We use those numbers to develop an index. And then for about half of the universities, they're at an index greater than 1. And the other half, they're at an index below 1. The sector average would be 1 in terms of that index. That index is then multiplied by the bachelor's degrees produced to get the weighted bachelor's degrees produced. This was done to try to promote efficiency of the model Back in 2016, CPE staff recommended that that be a separate item, a separate metric in the model, and it received a very minimal weighting. The decision of the working group, and it was led primarily by Bob Goldstein at U of L and the president at U of L, was to create that index and then weight the bachelor's degrees. Now, we've got several institutions, including UK, that have suggested that runs counter to the goal of trying to incentivize enrollment growth, which is to get people in the pipeline so that you can retain them, progress them, and produce more degrees. And so institutions that are growing, and that's primarily been UK in recent years, it's actually reducing the weighted number of degrees that UK gets credit for because their index is below the sector average because of their enrollment growth. And so that's something that is a suggested change. And we're going to bring that up at our second meeting and have some discussions about that. But this is one of those metrics that the folks at U of L, interestingly enough, since they're the ones that suggested it back in 2016, this adds some complexity to the model that could very easily be corrected.
It is complex.
And so the weighting's twofold. It's the FTE division, but it's also the research sector weighting.
That's correct. There's a weighting between the comprehensive universities and the research universities within the funding model. And we're going to get into that in more detail at our second meeting as well and explain the rationale for why that weighting was included in the model.
And we'll bring our lunch for that one.
Yeah, that'll be a long discussion.
We need to get Bill to build elevators.
Ultimately, what you're trying to achieve is funding parity or providing like funding for like activities across all of the institutions within the funding, the public university funding model. This slide shows the bachelor's degrees component funding per weighted degree. And if you'll notice, the pool size is now 53.7 instead of 47 million. That's because this is the pool after the 2022-23 distribution of 75 million within the public university funding model. And so what you've achieved is essentially 6 universities are at funding parity in terms of bachelor's degree. The bachelor's degree component at 7th, Morehead is very close. The red bars at Morehead and KSU represent hold harmless amounts. And because of that floor 2021 that was adopted 3 years ago, it protects those funds at Morehead and at KSU from being redistributed. Now, as President Thompson said a minute ago, we essentially have 7 institutions at funding parity, and he was correct. But I will point out that what President Morgan said in his comments is also correct, that as we get into the next year, 2023-24, they're going to be in the same situation that they were in this current year, because these funds were distributed on a non-recurring basis. And so we got to go right back almost to the starting point, if you will, and run the same percent share formula for the bachelor's degree component. And, Morehead is going to have some ground to make up because the funds were distributed on a non-recurring basis in the current year. And that's why at least every other year, it would be important in my mind, if General Assembly is amenable to the idea, if this working group is amenable to the idea. And in fact, several institutions, Paul Zarapata, Eli Capilouto at UK, have recommended that funds be distributed on a recurring basis periodically. And that would help institutions like Morehead. I mean, Morehead is at parity in the current year, but because those funds were distributed on a non-recurring basis, they have to start all over again next year. Okay, Sean, I'm gonna let you present these slides on the distribution of impact.
In this section, we have answers about how much has been appropriated to the performance, what was the source of that funding, how much has each institution received, what's the nature of that, is it recurring or non-recurring, is there alignment between outcomes produced and funding distributions, and then we have some slides about state funding per student. You can see on this slide that until year 4 of the model, which is we have a year zero, so the 5th year that we ran the model. There were no new funds from the General Assembly. All of the performance fund appropriations were in fact carve-outs from institutional resources, institutional general fund dollars. $17.3 million last fiscal year, $97.3 million this fiscal year. Next fiscal year, also $97.3 million flat funding. Next slide, please. This slide shows the years in which the distribution was recurring to an institution's base. So in 17-18, that $42.9 million, that 5% carve out for that first year performance funding. Year zero, that was recurring to the institution's base. 19-20 would have been the second year of that biennium, and so those funds became recurring. And then you'll remember in 2020-21 there was a 1-year budget, and so because of COVID, and so those funds became recurring, and that was coincided with the establishment of the funding floor, the floor 21.
Well, and the statute actually calls for those funds to become recurring and be part of that 2020-21 funding floor.
This slide shows the 2022-23 distribution of funds. On the left there, the $97.3 million. And it also shows the 11 metrics for each of the universities and indicates the green highlight and the check mark and the squares indicates those metrics for which that institution had growth at or above the sector average. So it's a very binary look at were you above average or not. And if you look at University of Kentucky, for example, 11 metrics above average, you can see a large distribution from the performance fund, $30.9 million. So,
Well, and there's also alignment if you look at UOL and Northern, and those are the 3 institutions among the public universities that receive proportionately more funding. So there is a certain degree of alignment between institutions that perform at or above the sector average on a larger share of the number of metrics and the funding they receive. I will point out one mistake in this entire PowerPoint is in that column for Northern Kentucky University, you see a check mark for 90 credit hour progression. That check mark should not be there. And so they don't have 9 metrics above the average. They have 8, the ones that are highlighted in green. So,
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
In the math kind of behind this grid, I understand the formula. As you put together who beats the sector average, you have baked in there the weights. Do you have baked in there the weights that the 2 research institutions receive for each graduate that the comprehensives do not? So for instance,
yeah, these are based on weighted metrics. That's
weighted metrics. So how mathematically, how would a regional ever outrun a research institution with those types of premiums on all the weights? Mathematically, how would it ever be done?
I just
need
want to point out one thing is
Yeah, if you're looking at unweighted bachelor's degrees, from 1 3-year rolling average from a year ago to the most recent 3-year rolling average, the percent growth at UK is the same for unweighted as it is for weighted. And I know that sounds antithetical, but we have a spreadsheet, we can show you that that's true. Even after you weight the degrees, the percent growth at UK would be the same whether you're comparing their unweighted growth last year to their unweighted growth this year, as if you compare weighted growth last year to weighted growth this year. So there's no advantage in that weighting in terms of meeting the sector average.
As we get to successive meetings, it'd be nice to see.
Yeah, we'll show you that.
in this chart, you see the formula share. I like the bar charts on the right. In each, so the first bar to the left for each institution is 18-19. The second one is 19-20. Third is 20-21, so on. And so you can see a trend. And this is the formula share, the allocate, what the model says each institution should receive of the allocable resources. So it doesn't look at what was actually distributed to the institutions, but just what the model says should have been distributed. It just looks at allocable resources, doesn't include the small school adjustment, doesn't include mandated programs.
Or hold harmless obligations.
Right. And so you can see that the formula shows that there are three institutions that three of the universities flat or have some positive growth. Northern Kentucky University had a little bit of a dip and then is on an upward trajectory there on the right, towards the right there. And then University of Louisville fairly flat at maintaining about 22% of the formula share. And then University of Kentucky, you see an increase.
Well, and Western was relatively flat for 3 years in a row, and in the last 2 years, you see a dip. But I want you to call to your attention, if you look at the percentages, the percentage point change for Northern and Western. Northern's percentage point change is positive, but not very large. Western's is slightly negative. But then when you actually consider all of the other resources, the small school adjustment and the hold harmless amounts, you're going to see here in a minute. I'm going to go ahead and skip this. Yeah, you can see that Northern and Western among the comprehensive institutions fared proportionately better than the other comprehensive institutions. If you look at the change in state funds for educating students between 2017 and 2023. Now, the reason for that was in 2017-18, Northern received a $5.6 million equity appropriation in the budget bill. Western had a $2.6 million equity adjustment. Those were outside the funding. But that's why you see Northern and Western with a larger percent change than the other comprehensives.
Bill, it's also a strategic decision internally to be more efficient.
Right.
So to have more dollars per student, you have to make some strategic choices, and that was also part of that decision.
And I'm gonna just back up for 1 second, just make people aware that the state funds for educating students is the total enacted general fund minus debt service, minus mandated programs. And then you add back in the performance distribution in column E and column F of the state funds for educating students. So those are the funds that support credit hour generation. If you look at the chart to the right, this is comparing state funds for educating students per full-time equivalent student. The blue bars are 2016-17, the red bars are 2021-22. You can see that the University of Kentucky, even though they've had an uptick in their funding for FTE, in the red bar, they're still below U of L. And even though Northern and Western have both seen increases in their funding for FTE, if you look at the red bars, on a per student basis, they're still funded less well than the other comprehensive institutions. Just quickly, in terms of student outcomes, and this is the last section, have our public universities increased numbers of students progressing and degrees produced? Are there differences by degree type and threshold? Have our KCPCS institutions increased numbers of students progressing and credentials produced? And are there differences in those credential types and thresholds? And are we still on track to achieve our 60 by 30 goal? How are we doing on 15? 15. Okay.
No question.
Yeah. So this slide shows university degree production on the left, and it's the change between academic years 2014 and 2021. It shows university student progression at 30, 60, and 90 credit hour thresholds. And again, that's between 2014 and 2021. As you can see, in terms of our STEM plus H degree production, that has increased by 28%. URM bachelor's degree production increased by about 38%. Those are outpacing the growth in total bachelor's degrees. And you can see the low income bachelor's degrees produced compared to that 2014 baseline, minus 1.4%. So even though there's a premium built into the funding model to try to encourage low income bachelor's degree production, that premium is the smallest compared to the URM and the STEM plus H premiums. And that might factor into this somewhat, but there's something else going on here besides just the premiums. It may be that culture
Well, and we can speculate on that, but the point being, just looking at the model, if I'm looking at a statewide perspective with our data, I want to say we need to really think about what percentage we put on the low income that's coming back, right? So, I mean, our data are going to point out, we use analytics in a way. Now, you're right. That must mean that Tim's going to, double down with our K-12 institutions to really work a plan to help the low income. That may cost you $1 or more, right? It's not going to be cheap. So these are the sorts of things that I think we need to look at policy wise, how it interacts with the data and the model. Right?
Looking quickly at the student progression graph on the right since 2014, students reaching the 30 and 60 credit hour thresholds have decreased by 17% and 9% respectively. You're going to see in a minute that's largely due to declining FTE student enrollment over this time period. A number of students who progressed beyond the 90 credit hour threshold have increased by 2.8%.
Quickly, that's saying, if you don't realize, is that our campuses are doing more with the students they have, but they can't do more if they don't have the students. I mean, so that's where you're going to see where we're going to run in problem with the 60 by 30 down the road, Bob Jackson, is that
It's a
we're not
pipeline
getting that
issue.
feeder. Do I?
It's a pipeline.
We're not
It's a
getting people
pipeline
in the
issue,
front end of the
right?
pipeline. Exactly.
With a 3-year rolling average, it doesn't play itself out in the model until.
That's right.
So what-
But you're seeing it now significantly, though, probably.
These two slides show KCTCS credentials in production, credentials produced by type on the left, and this is both the graphs of the change between 2016 and 2021. The story is very similar. Your STEM plus H credentials and URM credentials at KCTCS are growing faster than total credentials, and your low income credentials are growing the slowest among those different degree types. In terms of the progression on the left, again, declining enrollment has resulted in reduced student progression at every credit hour threshold. And this is an explanation for why we're seeing some of those, 30 and 60 progression hour numbers and 15 and 30 at KCTCS actually decreasing. You've got the red line for the research universities, and FTE enrollment is relatively flat between fall of 2013 and 2020. But in the comprehensive university sector, shown by the blue line, and the KCTCS sector shown by the green line, we're down in both of those sectors, down over 6,400 students, or 11% in the comprehensive university sector, down over 11,000 students, or 22% at KCTCS. And there was only one university that experienced growth in their enrollment over this time period, and that was UK. They were up 1,094 FTE students, or 4%. I just wanted to remind the working group that in February of 2021, the council adopted a resolution calling on CPE staff to work with the campus presidents and CBOs to take decisive action to try to combat enrollment declines. Data at the time showed what the chart just showed, that undergraduate enrollment was down at the universities and KCTCS. In response to that declining enrollment, President Thompson and our council members, working with campus presidents, have adopted the lowest tuition and fee increases over the past 3 years in over 2 decades. As you can see, 0.7 percentage point in 21, 1.2% in 22, and 1.5% in 2023. Okay.
The other thing I would throw in, and we have to stop early, is that and I know many of the campus leaders have changed. We took CPE, reformulated to create a P12 pipeline pilot, right? That we're working on. Representative Tipton knows so well. We've got to figure out how to make this thing work, or we're going to be in trouble in Kentucky, period. So that's one.
Okay. This downward trend in enrollment is something that the working group really needs to give some serious consideration to. over the next, 7-8 months as you consider changes in the funding model. Several of our campuses, in responding to the performance funding survey we sent out this past September, indicated support for adjustments in the model that encourage enrollment and completion of non-resident students, of adult learners, and of low-income students. Second to the last slide here, we are on track to hit our 60 by 30 college attainment goal. You can see the needed progress, 1.7% increase per year, and then the actual progress to those years between 2017 and 2021. That progress slowed somewhat in the most recent year, only 0.5 percentage point growth. But if you compare it to 5-year average, we're still growing on average at about 3% per year, which is higher than the 1.7% needed. President Thompson, you've already mentioned some of the other items like the strategic agenda, diversity policies that are helping us to stay on track with that 60 by 30 goal.
Yeah, I want to just point out though, is this is also driven somewhat by enrollment again. And this is going to slow us down. COVID is the 0.5 year. We have another year coming out, and we've done really well by comparison to other national states. Other states nationally that we've actually kept the marker up, but this won't continue. So yes, we're in stress and de-stress over the 60 by 30.
Although this should help.
Yeah. Well, this is just the latest data came out from National Student Clearinghouse and use actual data. And if you look at the Lumina work, what they do is they use estimates of looking at the national median salary, then add a 15% premium. So they don't count anything that doesn't produce the national median and a 15% premium. So you'll see their attainment rate a little bit different than ours. Simply, they don't count the people. We count the people. So we measure the highest per head. So that's where we get ours. And so does National Student Clearinghouse and others. With this, latest data just came out a month ago. Kentucky, once again, I mentioned earlier, we're number 2 in the nation, with Utah in completion. And so that's quite an accomplishment. To have Kentucky in this spot.
Bill, I would ask, and I think this is great data, and I think that the model is driving, there's some things here, but if we don't compare that to resource allocation, and that's really what this model is about allocated resources for getting completion of a multitude of things. So I'd love to see kind of where we're at as far as resources go, and we have folks around the table.
Are you talking about compared to other states? I think that's a great idea, President Patton, and we'll have that at our next meeting.
Bill, do you have, I know you showed a KCTCS in aggregate. I would be interested to see other colleges broke it down. I know that's difficult to do with.
Let me jump to this next slide. Next steps. Today, we just presented student outcomes data at a macro level.
Yeah.
We've got it on the agenda for our next meeting to provide data on the public universities and KCTCS institutions across all these metrics on an individual campus by campus basis so that you can see those differences.
Thank you. Great.
We're hoping to have somebody at the national level come in and provide us sort of an overview of the performance funding landscape around the nation. We're working on securing somebody to come in and do that. President Thompson has asked us to move these next 2 or 3 items up in the agenda so that those come first at our next meeting, but we're going to present the results of that 2022 performance funding survey that we sent out in September to the campuses. We're going to present CPE staff responses to that same survey. And then we're going to identify some of those major decision points that a number of our institutions have put on the table, proposals for adjustments to the model that are going to be the focus of the next 5 or 6 meetings as we go forward.
Bill, on the environmental scanner, are you going to show population growth decline and disaggregate by low income students of color? Because I just think that when you think about the complexion of the population we're trying to track over time, longitudinally, that's going to be the biggest challenge we all face here.
Well, and we'll certainly make note of that and ask somebody, whoever we secure, to come in to provide that presentation that they focus. Because I know equity concerns nationwide are the focus right now, and I suspect that's going on with performance funding models as well.
The tough thing comparing states to states, I figured out by being out there, is that states are very different in so many ways and what they look at, what they count on. We started behind the eight ball. We're a state that has a lot of low income students, a lot of first generation students, and more moving into it actually when you consider our Latinx population. We are a state that in fact has some historical elements bogging us down in many ways, right? And we're a state also where if you look at the resources in our K-12 based on the tax base structure locally has created even more issues in many cases. Not all states fall in those categories. So even if we look at a national landscape, I'm going to ask us to think about what is our landscape from our baseline to increase the outcomes that we want. So I tend to now, even though I know we need some national comparisons, and I'm okay with that, I would tend to say that our performance funding model is probably quickly out-matured almost every other state in many ways. And the discussion we're having around making it better is probably matured more than any other state. And we do allocate more dollars than others, as an example, than other states. So I would say I'm happy to provide some national landscape here, but just like I warned you about the Lumina piece, we know we're at 50.5 educational attainment. These people are out getting jobs, not on the welfare rolls, if you want to call it that. Whatever. Lumina is saying, well, we're not going to count some of those because they don't make the average plus 15% more. So I would be not that I don't use that to drive the agenda, I use some of that to drive the agenda. So if we look at the national landscape, I'd rather look at what's going on with low income in Kentucky. I'd rather look at how we create, and I know you got an omnibus bill possibly coming up, how we're going to drive exactly this partnership between higher ed and K-12 as an example versus.
Yeah, that's key. I mean, the pipeline issue has got to be discussed. It's got to be on the table. And many of us have talked about it today, and many of us have talked about it previously. But that pipeline issue, how do we force cause more students to go through this process? Because otherwise, the formula is going to continue at a macro level to decline.
Yeah, funding, the formula could be working just fine.
It could be working just fine.
But the input is not working fine.
Exactly. And somehow, some way, we've got to look at that and what metric, what do we put in place to turn that tide? That is key in this Commonwealth for the future.
I would have one kind of logistical ask is for the performance members, if we could get a secure portal to a Google Drive or something so that a repository, there's going to be a lot of production of materials instead of emails to kind of search through. It'd be great to be able to just log in and
So can we make sure we get something to take care of it?
We utilize Onboard for our board members, who can create accounts for that for you all.
Yeah, it's very secure.
So we can put all those resource materials out there with the link these folks can access, and then if there are requests to run scenarios, we can put those out there.
Be good.
Use the link.
I want to ask us anything else to bring to the table before I give my quick final comments and let you guys go do the great work you're doing. Any final statement for anyone? First of all, I'm going to say it's great to have this openness, and I appreciate, I have to look at it from my viewpoint. I work well with the Senate and the House, and the openness we have with them are very, and I appreciate our legislative folks in here and even our budget director, who I don't think is on anymore. It's been very transparent, very open. It's been very, what I call good questions asked, but good answers given. So I appreciate that. With presidents and us, David, I think you're absolutely right. We've been able to get on the same page almost all the time to do what's good for the state. Representative, in every single meeting we had, it's not purely about what's good for my institution. It's how do our institutions serve the state in the way that it needs to be served. And that's the other thing I will say is, if you look at our data, and I'm proud of this, you look at our data and we disaggregate at levels that no other state. I mean, our data system is powerful. You know, higher education is living up to what we said we were going to do many years ago. And I want to personally thank everybody for actually coming to all the meetings with that as a mentality. When these meetings are ended, I hope we all can be on the same page to look at how we still carry that out. So I appreciate y'all attending today. And Bill, Sean, as always, once again, I'll give Bill and Sean some credit. I mean, you're talking about gurus, they are. At times, though, we can bog you down. So tell us what you need in a way that you need it, and we'd be happy to provide it for you. Have a great day.
Thank you much.
2 minutes early. Yeah, it is.
See you soon.
Tomorrow, student.